year was 1305, and the streets of London buzzed with the calls of merchants selling their goods and the steady clip-clop of horses on the cobblestones. Yet, on this particular August morning, another sound was rising, a fierce roar from a crowd eager to witness one of history's most infamous executions. The man destined to die was William Wallace, a Scottish knight who boldly defied English rule and united his people against foreign domination. What unfolded that day was not merely a legal proceeding, but a meticulously planned spectacle of cruelty aimed at annihilating both the man and the powerful symbol he embodied. Popular culture, influenced by Hollywood films and romanticized legends, has softened Wallace's final moments into something almost heroic, a swift death for a valiant warrior. In truth, the reality was far darker and far more brutal. King Edward I, known as Longshanks, designed Wallace's punishment not merely as revenge, but as a lasting warning to all who might defy English authority. The execution was to be so horrendous, so public, and so thoroughly recorded that it would serve as a deterrent for generations. The method chosen, hanging, drawing, and quartering, was reserved for traitors and represented the peak of judicial cruelty in medieval England. This was not just about taking a life. It was about systematically destroying a man's dignity, crushing hope, and creating a spectacle so terrifying it would haunt Scotland's collective memory for centuries. Today, we peel back the myths to reveal the stark and unflinching truth of William Wallace's final hours. To fully grasp the horror of his execution, we must first understand the context of the world that shaped it. Late 13th and early 14th century, Scotland was a land caught between freedom and domination, where the idea of nationhood was still evolving and loyalty was often dictated by survival rather than allegiance. The Scottish Wars of Independence ignited after a succession crisis, with Edward I seizing the chance to assert direct English control, treating Scotland not as an independent kingdom, but as a rebellious province. William Wallace emerged from this turmoil, not as a noble seeking power, but as a minor landowner, fueled by personal tragedy and a fierce patriotism. His family had suffered under English occupation, and when he raised his sword at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, it was with the rage of a man who had lost everything and the vision of what a free Scotland might achieve. His victory was more than a military win. It was a profound symbol, proving that England's heavy cavalry could be defeated and that Scottish independence was an achievable reality. But Edward the Fine was no ruler to tolerate rebellion. Known for his brutal suppression of Welsh uprisings and his expulsion of Jews from England, Longshanks understood that insurrection was like a wildfire. If left unchecked, it could spread rapidly. Wallace's victory needed not only to be undone, but turned into a grim lesson. The English king aimed to make it clear that defying his authority would bring consequences so harsh that it would deter any future challengers. The political climate of 1305 was key to understanding Wallace's fate. By then, most Scottish nobles had sworn loyalty to Edward, choosing submission over destruction. Wallace's persistent defiance made him not only an enemy of England, but also a source of embarrassment to the Scottish aristocracy who had accepted English rule. Capturing him was a military necessity, but also a political imperative, as his very existence questioned the legitimacy of Scotland's surrender. The pursuit of William Wallace spanned several years and involved a vast network of spies, informants, and collaborators. Edward I placed a heavy bounty on Wallace's head, while English officials in Scotland systematically worked to isolate him from allies. Slowly, the net tightened as former friends turned against him, motivated by fear, greed, or the simple will to survive in a world where association with Wallace equaled death. As often happens in such tales, betrayal came from within. In August 1305, Wallace was captured near Glasgow, most likely due to the treachery of Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had pledged allegiance to the English crown. Though historians still debate the exact details, the outcome was certain. The man who embodied Scottish resistance was now in English custody. His capture was hailed in London as a monumental triumph. But for Edward I, it was merely the first step toward Wallace's ultimate degradation. The journey from Scotland to London was itself a form of psychological torment intended to crush Wallace's spirit before his final punishment. Bound and heavily guarded, he was paraded through English towns, where crowds gathered to gape at the notorious Scottish rebel. This was psychological warfare, at its most deliberate reduction of a hero into a spectacle, a leader into a public curiosity. By the time Wallace reached London, he had already suffered weeks of humiliation, but his ordeal was far from over. The trial of William Wallace was a sham, serving primarily as propaganda for the English crown. Held at Westminster Hall on the 23rd of August, 1305, the trial was conducted in Latina language Wallace most likely did not understand. He faced charges of treason, murder, sacrilege, arson, and a host of other offenses against the English crown. The irony was clear to contemporaries. Wallace was being tried for treason against a king he never recognized as his sovereign. When allowed to speak, Wallace famously declared he could not commit treason against Edward I because he was never his subject. This defiant declaration sealed Wallace's fate. Although the verdict had been decided long before the trial began, the proceedings were merely a theatrical display, designed to cloak a foregone execution in a semblance of legality. All the judges, appointed by Edward I himself, were determined to show no mercy to the man who had become the emblem of Scottish rebellion. The charges against Wallace were meticulously constructed to justify the extreme nature of his sentence. Treason, the gravest of crimes, carried the full horror of hanging, drawing, and quartering. Additional accusations of murder and sacrilege tied to his attacks on English soldiers and clergy painted him as a criminal rather than a noble warrior. By this point, the English legal system had become an instrument of state terror, and Wallace was its most infamous victim. The sentence was delivered with solemn ceremony. Wallace was to be drawn through the streets of London, hanged by the neck but cut down before death, disemboweled alive, beheaded, and finally, his body was to be divided into 4 parts. Each stage of this punishment held symbolic significance. The drawing signified his humiliation, the hanging his rejection by divine grace, the disembowelment his spiritual corruption, and the quartering his utter destruction. This was not simply execution, it was total annihilation. On the morning of the 23rd of August, 1305, London awoke to clear skies and warm weather. Preparations For the grim spectacle had been underway for days. Scaffolds were erected, and crowds streamed in from across England, eager to witness the demise of the Scottish insurgent. The authorities had turned Wallace's execution into a public spectacle akin to a festival, complete with vendors selling food and drink to the assembled masses. This event was not merely about justice, it was entertainment. It served as a stark reminder of the English crown's power and the grim fate awaiting those who defied it. Wallace was stripped naked and bound to a hurdler wooden frame designed to drag him through the streets. The route was meticulously planned to maximize his humiliation and the spectacle. Starting from the Tower of London, where he had been imprisoned, the procession wound through the busiest parts of the city, ensuring the largest possible audience witnessed his degradation. The cobblestones tore at his flesh as he was dragged behind horses, leaving a trail of blood marking his final journey. The onlookers were a mix of curious spectators, patriotic English citizens, and those who simply found pleasure in watching suffering. Medieval executions were public affairs, both a form of amusement and a chilling display of royal authority. As Wallace passed, the crowd jeered and hurled refuse at him, encouraged by officials intent on ensuring his last moments were as degrading as possible. This was cruelty sanctioned by the state on a grand scale. The procession moved deliberately, slowly, prolonging Wallace's agony and allowing more people to gather for the gruesome spectacle. Contemporary reports indicate that Wallace remained conscious throughout the entire ordeal, his gaze fixed on some distant point, as if looking beyond the immediate horror surrounding him. Whether this was an act of defiance, resignation, or sheer shock is unknown, but witnesses consistently noted that he never cried out or pleaded for mercy, a fact that would become a key part of his enduring legend. At Smithfield, London's customary execution site, a scaffold had been erected specifically for Wallace's death. The crowd was larger and rowdier here than along the procession route, with vendors selling pies and ale to eager spectators who had secured prime viewing spots hours in advance. The festive atmosphere was intentional. English authorities aimed to frame Wallace's death not as martyrdom, but as a grand celebration of English justice and dominance. The executioner, a seasoned professional likely accustomed to such grisly tasks, began his work with practiced precision. Wallace was first hanged by the neck, but the noose was deliberately placed to cause strangulation rather than a swift death. By breaking the neck, the crowd watched as he struggled to breathe, his face turning purple and his body convulsing in the agonizing universal death dance caused by asphyxiation. Just as his consciousness began to wane, he was cut down still alive and fully aware of what was happening. What followed was the most gruesome segment of the execution. While still conscious, Wallace was disemboweled. The executioner used a sharp blade to open his abdomen and methodically remove the internal organs, one by one. Contemporary witnesses described Wallace's screams as unlike anything they had ever heard, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very depths of human agony. Each organ was raised high for the crowd's viewing before being cast into a fire prepared specifically for this purpose. The act of burning Wallace's entrails was deeply symbolic. In medieval belief, the bowels were the seat of emotion and compassion. By burning them before his eyes, the executioner was symbolically stripping Wallace of his humanity, rendering him less than human in the eyes of the spectators. The pungent smell of burning flesh and organs filled the air, adding a new layer of terror to the nightmarish scene. Throughout this horrific process, Wallace remained awake, his eyes open and alert, even as his body was methodically destroyed. Some accounts claim he continued to speak, though his words have been lost to history. The executioner's expertise was not just in inflicting the maximum amount of pain, but in prolonging Wallace's life as long as possible. Death was to be a release, not a culmination of suffering. Finally, in a merciful act, the executioner delivered a single sharp axe blow that severed Wallace's head, ending his torment at last. Yet, even in death, the humiliation persisted. His severed head was raised for the crowd to see, blood dripping from the wound, before being taken away for later public display. The body was then divided into 4 parts, each segment held up for public viewing like cuts of meat in a butcher's shop. The handling of Wallace's remains was as meticulously planned as his execution. His head was preserved by dipping it in tar and was mounted on a spike atop London Bridge, where it remained for years as a grim warning to anyone contemplating rebellion against English rule. The 4 quarters of his body were sent to different Scottish towns: Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perthware. They were displayed openly as a stark reminder of the fate awaiting any who defied the crown. This gruesome dispersal of Wallace's body was more than savage cruelty. It was a calculated political statement. Each piece sent a clear message to the local populace, a tangible symbol of English supremacy and the consequences of resistance. The English recognized that symbols held as much power as armies, and Wallace's dismembered remains became a potent emblem of English control over Scotland. The immediate effects of Wallace's execution were precisely what Edward I had intended. The brutal display appeared to crush Scottish resistance. Many of Wallace's supporters either fled abroad or submitted to English authority, reasoning that no cause was worth such a horrifying death. Yet Edward I had badly misjudged the Scottish reaction to Wallace's martyrdom. Instead of extinguishing resistance, the brutal execution fueled it. The sheer terror of Wallace's death became a rallying cry for those unwilling to accept English domination. Robert the Bruce, who would eventually ascend as King of Scotland, was reportedly galvanized into action by witnessing the spectacle of Wallace's execution, recognizing in it the harsh reality of English rule. Wallace's grisly death also influenced the strategies of future Scottish rebels. The lesson was unmistakable. Capture by the English meant unimaginable torture and humiliation. Consequently, Scottish fighters adopted a fiercer, more desperate form of warfare, often choosing to die in battle rather than surrender. Wallace's execution forged a culture of merciless warfare, where no quarter was given or expected. The political impact extended beyond Scotland's borders. Other European powers watched the execution with a mix of horror and intrigue, seeing it as an example of English tactics that could be used against them. This brutality became ingrained in England's reputation, contributing to its diplomatic isolation and complicating foreign relations in later years. Edward I of strength was clear, but so too was the message of ruthless cruelty. The historical records of Wallace's execution are extensive, drawn from multiple contemporary sources that offer a detailed account of the event. The Lanercost Chronicle, written by English monks, presents the execution in stark, clinical terms, documenting the crowd's reactions and the prolonged suffering of Wallace. While these English sources carry an inherent bias, they provide valuable insight into medieval perspectives on justice and punishment. Scottish accounts, though fewer, offer a contrasting view of the execution. The Chronicle of John of Fordun depicts Wallace as a martyr who met death with unwavering dignity and bravery, highlighting his refusal to plead for mercy or abandon his cause. Though these accounts may be somewhat romanticized, they capture the profound effect Wallace's death had on Scottish national identity, and how a military defeat was transformed into a moral triumph. The legal documents from Wallace's trial and execution offer perhaps the most impartial record of the events. Preserved in the English National Archives, these papers reveal the meticulous planning behind both the trial and the execution. Every aspect, from the formal charges against Wallace to the handling of his remains, was carefully recorded, indicating that English authorities fully grasped the historical weight of their actions. Eyewitness testimonies from both English and Scottish sources add further layers of detail to the narrative. Some recount the crowd's bloodthirsty excitement, while others emphasize the noble composure with which Wallace faced his end. These differing perspectives underscore the complexity of the event and its varying significance for different audiences. The impact of William Wallace's execution far surpassed the immediate political ramifications of his death. Over the centuries, his story evolved into a foundational myth of Scottish nationalism, inspiring countless generations to resist foreign oppression. The savage nature of his execution transformed him from a defeated rebel into a potent symbol of martyrdom and defiance, becoming more influential in death than he ever was in life. Wallace's execution also left a lasting mark on the development of international law and the principles of human rights. Later, legal scholars cited his treatment as a prime example of judicial brutality that violated essential human dignity. The idea that even enemies of the state were entitled to basic humane treatment began to emerge partly as a response to the excesses exemplified by Wallace's execution. The cultural legacy of Wallace's death is evident in the literature, art, and music that followed through the ages. From medieval ballads to contemporary films, his tale has been retold time and again, with each generation discovering new meanings in his sacrifice. The execution scene, in particular, stands as a powerful symbol of the conflict between oppression and liberty, tyranny and justice. The psychological effect on the Scottish people was deep and enduring. Wallace's execution created a collective trauma that became a core element of Scottish cultural identity, a shared memory of suffering that unified the nation in a way that military victories alone could not. The horror of his death became a source of strength, demonstrating that certain values are worth enduring pain for, and that dignity can be preserved even in the face of ultimate degradation. The method of execution chosen for Wallace hanging, drawing, and quartering was itself a profound statement about the nature of medieval justice and the relationship between ruler and subject. This extreme form of punishment was reserved for traitors, those who had broken the sacred bond between king and his people. By applying this punishment to Wallace, Edward I was declaring that all people living in the British Isles were his subjects, regardless of whether they accepted his rule. The public aspect of the execution was just as important. Medieval justice functioned as a form of theater, designed to reinforce social hierarchies and political power through dramatic spectacle. Wallace's execution was likely the most elaborate such event of its time, involving not only the physical destruction of the victim, but also the psychological manipulation of the audience. The crowd was not just watching justice being served. They were taking part in a ritual that reinforced state authority. The meticulous documentation of the execution shows that the English authorities were fully aware they were crafting a historic moment. Every detail, from the path of the procession to the handling of Wallace's remains, was carefully recorded, signaling an intention that the event be remembered. This execution was not merely about punishing Wallace, but about constructing a narrative that would advance English political interests for generations. The international significance of the execution should not be underestimated. Medieval Europe was an interconnected network where news spread rapidly and reputation was crucial. Wallace's execution was witnessed by foreign dignitaries and reported throughout the continent, helping to build England's image as a power prepared to use extreme cruelty to maintain control. This reputation shaped diplomatic relations for decades. Reflecting on the horror of Wallace's execution reveals unsettling truths about human nature and the wielding of power. The crowds that gathered were ordinary people, not monsters people, conditioned to accept and even take pleasure in the systematic destruction of another human being. Their enthusiasm exposes the dark potential for cruelty that exists within civilized societies when it is given official approval. The execution also illustrates how quickly extraordinary brutality can become normalized. The executioner who dismembered Wallace was a professional adept at prolonging pain. The officials overseeing the event were bureaucrats, following established protocols for dealing with traitors. The institutionalization of such extreme cruelty may be even more alarming than the cruelty itself, reminding us that civilization's veneer is often thinner than it seems. Wallace's transformation from rebel to martyr highlights the unpredictable power of political symbolism. Edward I intended his execution to demonstrate that resistance was futile, yet it instead created a powerful emblem of noble sacrifice for principle. The excessive nature of the punishment undermined its deterrent effect. The horror was so profound it became sublime, transcending its immediate purpose to become something much greater. The lasting fascination with Wallace's story speaks to humanity's need for heroes who embody our highest values, especially or perhaps most powerful in the face of ultimate suffering. His execution reminds us that some of the greatest victories are moral rather than military, that dignity can be preserved even when everything else is lost, and that the human spirit can triumph even as the body is destroyed. The tale of William Wallace's execution is ultimately about the price of liberty and the cost of standing by one's principles. In our comfortable modern lives, it is easy to forget that the freedoms we enjoy were won through the bloodshed and suffering of those who came before us. Wallace's brutal death is a stark reminder that freedom is never free, and that those who benefit from it bear the responsibility to honor the sacrifices made on their behalf. Today, as we confront new threats to freedom and human dignity, Wallace's story remains as relevant as ever. While the methods have evolved, the fundamental battle between oppression and liberty endures. His execution teaches us that there are causes worth enduring hardship for, principles worth dying for, and that each generation must decide for itself the balance between freedom and security. The blood-stained cobblestones of medieval London still resonate with the message that some things are worth any cost, and that the human spirit, even when shattered, can inspire others to persevere through the darkest nights.